Hello everyone, welcome to History and Culture. More than 100 years ago in China, women judged their beauty primarily not based on their facial features or body shape but on the size of their feet. 3-inch golden lotus was a standard of aesthetic judgment for women at that time. Women achieved small feet by practicing foot binding, which involved tightly wrapping the feet with cloth strips, bending the toes and arches inward toward the soles, and making the feet smaller. According to ancient customs, women with feet measuring 3 inches were called golden lotus, those with 4 inches were called silver lotus, and those with feet larger than 4 inches were called iron lotus. If we approach this practice from a scholarly perspective, it may not seem significant, but from an aesthetic standpoint, it is undoubtedly a nightmare. There is much debate about who was the first person to practice foot binding in history. However, the most credible theory is that foot binding appeared during the Northern Song Dynasty and became prevalent during the Southern Song Dynasty. Before the Northern Song Dynasty, the practice of foot binding was quietly developing. According to legend, during the Shang Dynasty, Daji, who was greatly favored by King Zhou, was originally a fox spirit disguised as a human. However, her feet were not transformed, so she wrapped them with long strips of cloth. Other concubines in the palace also followed suit to attract the king's favor, and foot binding thus became popular. There is another theory that foot binding originated during the Qing Dynasty. It is said that Emperor Qin Shi Huang used small feet as one of the standards for selecting concubines. Some people believe foot binding originated during the Han Dynasty. According to the account in the book Lianying, Record of Lotus Shoes, Zhao Fian, a favored concubine of Emperor Qing of the Han Dynasty, was able to perform dances on her palms because of her slender figure and small feet. The Han Dynasty's poem, Peacock Flies Southeast, also described stepping on silk shoes and delicate steps, exquisitely unparalleled, which is considered evidence of the origin of foot binding. The widely accepted belief is that foot binding originated during the Northern Song Dynasty. Initially, it appeared in the royal court and upper-class society, where princesses considered small feet beautiful and even used them as a status symbol. The History of Song, 5 Elements records, recorded, during the reign of Emperor Lizong, palace women bound their feet to make them slender and straight. This is historical evidence regarding foot binding among palace women. With social development and the admiration of rulers, foot binding gradually became a cultural trend embraced by both noblewomen and common people. It formed an aesthetic where small feet and foot binding were considered beautiful and honorable. Even the famous poet Su Shi, also known as Su Dongpa, wrote a poem dedicated to foot binding. This harmful custom did not gradually disappear with the passage of time but instead became more prevalent. The Jin and Yuan dynasties, as foreign ethnic groups initially, did not have the custom of foot binding. However, after integrating into Han Chinese culture following their rule over the Central Plains, foot binding gradually gained popularity among their own people as well. By the Ming and Qing dynasties, foot binding had already deeply penetrated society, and there were few people who opposed it. Despite the fact that this beauty was achieved through the suffering of women, they had already lost their ability to judge themselves under the influence of this trend and became addicted to it. Foot binding caused significant harm to the human body. To create small feet, the already grown feet needed to be bent and twisted, tightly wrapped with long strips of cloth. Even during sleep, the bindings could not be removed, and specially made sleeping shoes were worn to prevent the foot wrappings from loosening, allowing the feet to heal and shrink further. This process often began when girls were 6 or 7 years old. Young girls, who should have been carefree at such a young age, were forced to conform to the societal beauty standards and endure pain to achieve a pair of 3-inch golden lotus feet, adopting the appearance of delicate willows and supporting the wind. The cultural practices of a certain period reflect the political and economic circumstances of that period, and foot binding precisely reflects the shortcomings of feudal society. It is like a quagmire capable of engulfing people, trapping them and making it difficult for them to escape. Before the Song dynasty, although foot binding was not a mainstream custom, people's preference for small feet had already started to emerge. From the legend of Daji during the Qing Dynasty to Zhao Fian's palm dance in the Han Dynasty, each instance illustrates the ancient people's pursuit of delicacy and their aesthetic appreciation for small feet. Initially, the praise for 3-inch feet came from rulers and the upper class, who followed the principles of Confucianism and used the 3 obediences and 4 virtues as a tool for governance. The superior governs the inferior, the father governs the son, the husband governs the wife, was the truth they upheld, and the subordination of women to men was taken for granted. In a patriarchal society, the fragility exhibited by foot-binding women was more in line with the default rule of men in charge of external affairs, women in charge of internal affairs. The prevalence of foot-binding among women was reinforced by the will of the ruling class. Furthermore, ancient literati played a role in promoting foot-binding. The mainstream ideology in ancient China was Confucianism, and the main disseminators of Confucianism were the literati. Many of them were talented, but they were also sometimes influenced by feudal thoughts. Some of them enjoyed playing with the shoes of foot-binding prostitutes, while others studied foot-binding as a scholarly pursuit. Even great literary figures like Su Shi and Qianlong considered foot-binding to be a normal matter. Qianlong wrote, "Pale yellow bow-shaped shoes, small waist that fears being blown down by the wind." Other cynical literati also researched various methods and styles of foot-binding, spreading this pathological aesthetic to a wider audience, deeply influencing their minds and bodies. Ultimately, under the influence of mainstream society, an increasing number of ordinary people lost themselves within the collective and began to embrace foot-binding as a standard of beauty. Foot-binding continued for hundreds of years without seeing significant opposition, but rather with more women believing that foot-binding could demonstrate their grace, gentleness, and delicate image. When victims are unaware of their own objectification and actually identify with and pursue this objectification, the custom will continue to thrive and prevail for centuries. In conclusion, foot-binding actually reflects the oppression of women by patriarchal power and the control of the ruling class over the lower class. Meanwhile, the women who are victims of foot-binding are deeply trapped, striving for the deformed aesthetic imposed by society, making foot-binding an enduring harmful custom. Viewing the long-standing foot-binding custom from a god's perspective naturally leads to disdain, as it is difficult to understand the appeal of the 3-inch golden lotus beyond the pain and harm it causes to the body. However, when looking back at history and criticizing foot-binding, it is crucial to recognize that what we oppose is not only the surface practice of foot-binding but also the coercion of collective consciousness on individual consciousness. Only then can we completely eradicate the concept of the 3-inch golden lotus from our minds. This is History and Culture channel. Like and subscribe are the biggest help and support for us. Thank you everyone. See you next time.